In 3 minutes, the pilot said, prepare for crash landing. The plane was falling from the sky. Everyone on Flight 2847 knew they were about to die. But the quiet farmer in seat 14C wasn't ready to give up. She stood up and said, I'm a pilot. Let me help. The announcement came at 37,000 feet, delivered in Captain Richardson's controlled voice. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing multiple system failures and severe structural damage. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for emergency landing. We have no airport within gliding distance. Brace for impact in terrain in 3 minutes. Absolute silence followed. Then came the sounds. A child's confused question, a woman's sharp sob, the rustling of 200 bodies shifting in seats that had suddenly become too small, too temporary. Sarah Chen sat in 14C with her hands folded in her lap, calloused fingers laced together with the same patient stillness she'd learned from 15 years of waiting for wheat to grow, for storms to pass, for seasons to turn. She wore the same clothes she always wore on the rare occasions she left the farm: plain jeans, a faded flannel shirt, scuffed work boots that had seen more mud than carpet. Her carry-on bag, wedged under the seat in front of her, was patched with duct tape in 3 places. To the business travelers in their pressed suits and the families in their vacation clothes, she was invisible in the way that rural working people often are in spaces designed for everyone else, present but not quite seen, noticed but not quite acknowledged. The flight attendant moved down the aisle with a different purpose, her professional smile replaced by something harder. Ma'am, remove your glasses and any sharp objects. Place your head between your knees when I give the signal. Sarah nodded. The flight attendant's hand touched her shoulder and moved on. Around her, the cabin transformed into a theater of final moments. The man in 14B typed frantically on his phone, tears streaming. Across the aisle, a grandmother held 2 children, whispering prayers or lullabies. A young couple held hands so tightly their knuckles had gone white. Sarah closed her eyes and remembered. 16 years since she'd last sat in a cockpit with her hands on the controls. 16 years since she'd worn the uniform with gold wings and classified patches. 16 years since the night she'd walked away from Edwards Air Force Base, choosing wheat fields over test flights, silence over the constant screaming in her mind every time she pushed an experimental aircraft past its limits. She'd been one of the best among the handful of pilots trusted with aircraft so classified they barely had names, just program numbers and classification levels. She'd flown things that shouldn't fly, tested systems engineers weren't sure would work, and survived 17 emergency situations that would have killed less trained pilots. But surviving and living were different. After her 300th test flight, after her 7th emergency landing, after ejecting from a prototype at 60,000 feet and spending 40 minutes descending through darkness wondering if her parachute had been damaged, she'd realized she was spending her entire life preparing to die in interesting ways. So she'd stopped, filed her paperwork, and disappeared into rural Iowa to grow corn and soybeans. The farm had been good to her, quiet, honest. She'd built a life measured in harvests instead of flight hours. She'd almost convinced herself she was just a farmer now. But knowledge doesn't fade. She'd kept up, not deliberately, just as a habit she couldn't break. Aviation journals under a P.O. box number. Accident reports read like mystery novels, new aircraft systems and emergency procedures studied with the same focus she applied to soil composition. It was like speaking a language she never used but couldn't forget. The aircraft dropped suddenly, a sickening lurch. The woman behind Sarah vomited. A man prayed loudly in Spanish. The engines made sounds engines should never make. Through the window, Sarah saw the wing, the outboard aileron partially separated, hanging at an angle, visible buckling near the engine mount, flaps stuck asymmetrically, making a controlled landing nearly impossible. Captain Richardson's voice came through again, cracks showing in her composure. Flight attendants, seated positions now. Passengers, brace for impact. This is happening in less than 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Sarah calculated descent rate, altitude, impact speed. They were at maybe 12,000 feet, dropping fast. At their current configuration, impact would be survivable for maybe 20% if they were lucky, more likely for none. Around her, people assumed crash positions. The man in 14B was still typing. The grandmother wrapped herself around the children. Flight attendants strapped into jump seats, faces composed. Sarah sat perfectly still and made her decision. She unbuckled her seat belt. The flight attendant looked up sharply. "Ma'am, you need to stay seated." "I'm a pilot," Sarah said, already moving. "Military test pilot. I need to speak to the captain." "Ma'am, you cannot." Sarah walked forward, using seatbacks for balance. The cockpit door was locked. She pounded on it with authority. "Captain Richardson, I'm a military pilot. Open the door. I can help." 5 seconds. Nothing. The aircraft dropped again. Then the lock clicked and the door opened. Captain Richardson's face appeared. Mid-40s, short dark hair, eyes red-rimmed. "This is not the time, Captain. My name is Sarah Chen, test pilot for 13 years, specialist in emergency recovery. 2,000 hours in aircraft with severe failures. I can see your wing damage, and I know what you're dealing with. Let me in or we're all dead in 2 minutes." Something in Sarah's voice made the captain's expression shift. "You're serious. Dead serious. Let me see your controls." The cockpit door opened fully. Sarah stepped in where 2 people were fighting a losing battle. The co-pilot wrestled with the yoke, monitoring screens filled with red warnings. The view through the windscreen was forest and mountains getting closer. "We've lost hydraulics on primary and secondary systems," Richardson said rapidly. "Partial power to back up electric controls, but response is maybe 15% normal. Asymmetric flaps, structural damage on the left wing, uncontrolled descent. I've tried everything in the emergency procedures. There's no airport within gliding range. Preparing for impact in 90 seconds. Sarah's eyes swept the instrument panel. She saw the problem immediately. The pilots were fighting the aircraft's tendency to roll left using constant right aileron pressure that was eating their remaining control authority. Standard procedure, but when there was no airport, standard procedures would kill you. "You're fighting the roll," Sarah said. "Stop." "What?" The co-pilot looked at her like she was insane. "If we stop, we'll spiral." "Exactly. Captain, you need to let me have the controls. What I'm about to suggest violates every procedure in your manual, but we're past procedures. We're into experimental territory now." Richardson's hands were still on her yoke, but her eyes were evaluating Sarah with the intensity of someone making a life or death judgment call in real time. "What are you proposing?" "The aircraft wants to roll left because of the wing damage. Fighting it is using up all your control authority and accelerating your descent. Instead of fighting it, we use it. We enter a controlled left bank, use the asymmetric lift to slow our descent rate, and convert altitude into distance. We can't reach an airport, but there's..." Sarah's mind was pulling up maps she'd studied years ago, terrain features from routes she'd flown. "There should be a valley system about 40 miles northwest. If we can extend our glide, we might reach flat land, maybe even a road. A controlled spin." Richardson's voice was skeptical but no longer dismissive. "At this altitude with this damage, not a spin. A spiral descent at maximum lift coefficient, using the damaged wing's tendency to drop as an asset instead of a problem. We'll lose altitude slower than in this dive and we'll cover lateral distance. It's a technique we used in test scenarios for aircraft with asymmetric control failure." "I've never heard of that procedure." "Because it's not a procedure. It's improvisation based on aerodynamic principles. Captain, we have maybe 60 seconds before we're too low for this to work. I need your decision." The aircraft lurched again. Through the windscreen, Sarah could see individual trees. The ground proximity warning system was blaring continuously. The co-pilot was openly terrified, looking between Richardson and Sarah like a man watching his last hope evaporate. Captain Richardson took her hands off the yoke. "Take it." Sarah slid into the captain's seat, her hands finding the controls with muscle memory that hadn't faded even after 16 years of dormancy. The yoke felt foreign and familiar at the same time, different from the fighters she'd flown, but the fundamental language was the same. She could feel the aircraft through her hands, feel how it wanted to move, what it was trying to tell her. "Co-pilot, give me full power on the right engine. Reduce left engine to 60%, Sarah said, her voice dropping into the calm, clipped tone she used to use on test flights when things were falling apart. "We're going to induce the roll deliberately. When I say now, you're going to help me coordinate rudder and aileron to control the descent spiral. Our target is a 45-degree bank descending at 2,000 feet per minute instead of our current 4,000. We're trading vertical speed for horizontal distance. This is insane, the co-pilot breathed, but his hands were already moving to the throttles. It's physics, Sarah corrected. Richardson, I need you on communications. Find me the longest straight section of road or clear land within 40 miles northwest of our current position. We need at least a mile of clear space, preferably 2. Her hands moved on the controls, not fighting the aircraft's damaged tendencies but working with them, guiding the dying plane into a maneuver that shouldn't work but might give them a chance. She released the right aileron pressure gradually, letting the left wing drop, but simultaneously adding right rudder and adjusting engine power to prevent the drop from becoming an uncontrolled roll. The aircraft tilted left, the horizon rotating through the windscreen. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of G-forces shifting, the peculiar stomach lift of transitioning from one flight regime to another. Behind them in the cabin, she knew passengers were experiencing terror beyond anything they'd felt yet. But there was no time to explain, no way to make them understand that the apparent loss of control was actually the first step toward saving them. We're in the spiral, she said quietly. Descent rate is 2,500 feet per minute. Better. Co-pilot, adjust left engine to 55%. Let's steepen the bank to 50 degrees. We're going to extend our glide range by converting our dive energy into a shallower descent over greater distance. Trust the math. Sarah's eyes were scanning instruments, her brain processing airspeed, altitude, vertical speed, and bank angle, all while her hands made constant tiny adjustments to keep the spiral stable. It was like riding a bicycle on a wire while juggling. If you thought about it too much, you'd fall, but if you let your training take over, if you trusted your instincts, the body knew what to do. The aircraft was responding, not happily, not smoothly, but responding. The impossible was becoming nearly improbable. I've got something, Richardson said from behind her, pulling up navigation charts on her screen. State Route 47 runs through a valley 38 miles northwest. There's a straight section, maybe a mile and a half, mostly clear. It's not an airport, but it's a runway if we make it one, Sarah finished. Give me a heading. The numbers came through and Sarah adjusted, using differential engine power and the limited control authority they still had to guide the spiraling aircraft toward their impossible target. She was flying now with an intensity she hadn't felt in years, every sense heightened, every calculation automatic. This was what she'd been good at, taking broken aircraft in impossible situations and finding the narrow path between going to crash and might survive. Altitude 6,000 feet, the co-pilot called out. Descent rate holding at 2,400. We're actually extending the glide. We're still 20 miles short, Richardson said quietly. I know. Sarah's jaw was tight. We need to flatten this spiral, pick up more airspeed, trade energy for distance. Co-pilot, when I tell you, we're going to roll out of this bank hard and fast. It's going to stress the damaged wing and we might lose control surfaces, but we need one final glide segment. If the wing holds, we might reach that road. If it doesn't hold, then we were going to die anyway. At least this way we tried something. Sarah's hands adjusted again, feeling the aircraft, sensing the loads on the damaged structure. Richardson, I need you to prepare the cabin. Tell them we're attempting an emergency landing on a rural highway. Tell them it's going to be rough. Tell them to brace for extreme impact forces. She heard Richardson's voice come over the cabin speakers, delivering impossible news to people who'd already accepted death and were now being asked to hope again. Sarah blocked it out, focused only on the aircraft, on the dance of keeping a broken machine in the air just a little longer. Altitude 4,000 feet. 23 miles from the road. Rolling out, Sarah announced. Her hands moved decisively, pulling the yoke right, adding right rudder, adjusting throttles. The aircraft fought her, the damaged wing screaming in protest, metal groaning under stress that exceeded design specifications. For one terrible moment, Sarah felt the controls go mushy, felt the aircraft begin to depart controlled flight into a spin that would be genuinely unrecoverable. Then something in the damaged structure shifted, settled, and the aircraft responded. The bank angle decreased from 50 degrees to 30 to 15. They were wings level now, still descending but no longer spiraling, trading their carefully built altitude for distance toward the highway that was somewhere ahead in the forested valley. Descent rate 3,500 feet per minute, the co-pilot said, his voice tight. We're dropping faster than in the spiral. I know. We only need 60 more seconds. Sarah's eyes were locked on the windscreen, searching the terrain ahead for the road Richardson had found on the charts. The valley was heavily forested, trees covering the mountainsides in a green carpet that looked beautiful and deadly. Impact with those trees at their current speed would shred the aircraft like tissue paper. Altitude 2,000 feet. 15 miles from target. The math was bad. Sarah could feel it, could see it in the numbers. They were dropping too fast. Even with the extended glide range from the spiral descent, they'd gained distance but spent altitude. And now they were running out of both. The highway was going to be close. Desperately, impossibly close. I see it. Richardson pointed through the windscreen. Sarah saw it too. A gray line cutting through the forest, straight for maybe a mile before curving away into the hills. It looked like a thread, impossibly narrow, utterly inadequate. It was also their only chance. Altitude 1,000 feet, 8 miles out. Sarah's hands were making constant adjustments now, using every scrap of remaining control authority to stretch their glide just a little further. The aircraft was shaking, rattling, pieces of damaged structure vibrating at frequencies that suggested imminent failure. Warning alarms were screaming. The ground proximity system was shouting, "Terrain! Terrain! Pull up!" in an automated voice that didn't understand they were trying. "We're not going to make it," the co-pilot said, and Sarah heard the acceptance in his voice, the recognition of mathematical reality. "Watch me," Sarah said quietly. She pushed the nose down slightly, trading altitude for airspeed, accelerating into a shallow dive that was either going to give them the energy to reach the highway or slam them into the forest 500 feet sooner. It was a gamble, but everything about this had been a gamble. And she'd spent her career in test flying learning that sometimes you had to break the rules to survive. Altitude 500 feet. 3 miles out. The trees were individual now, not a carpet but distinct shapes rushing past below. Sarah could see the highway clearly, could see the tiny cars on it that looked like toys, could see the straight section that would be their runway if they could just reach it, just cover those final 3 miles. Altitude 200 feet. They weren't going to make it. Sarah could see that now, could see that the math had beaten them, that they'd extended the impossible but couldn't quite reach the miraculous. They were going to come down short, probably a mile short, into forest that would tear them apart. Unless, brace, Sarah shouted and slammed the throttles to maximum power on both engines. The damaged engines screamed in protest, pushed beyond any safe operating parameters, burning fuel at a rate that would destroy them in minutes, but they didn't need minutes. They needed 30 seconds. The additional thrust was tiny, barely enough to notice in normal flight, but they weren't in normal flight. They were in a damaged aircraft at minimum controllable airspeed, and even a small thrust increase meant a slightly flatter glide, slightly more distance. The engines were making sounds engines should never make. Something in the left engine exploded. A small explosion, relatively speaking, but enough to send vibrations through the airframe that felt like the aircraft was tearing itself apart from the inside. Black smoke streamed from the cowling. Altitude 100 feet. 1 mile out. They were below the treeline now, flying through the valley with forest on both sides, the highway visible ahead but still impossibly far. Sarah could see a semi-truck on the road, could see it swerving as the driver spotted an airliner bearing down on him at highway level, 50 feet. They were too low. They were going to clip the trees before the road, going to cartwheel into the forest and die in a fireball after everything they'd done, after coming so impossibly close. Then the tree line ended. They were over the highway. Sarah cut the throttles and pulled the nose up hard, bleeding off what little airspeed they had left, forcing the aircraft to drop rather than fly. The landing gear was still up. No time to lower it, no hydraulics to lower it anyway. This was going to be a belly landing at 140 knots on asphalt. That was never designed for aircraft. The tail struck first, a shriek of rending metal that sounded like the aircraft screaming. Then the belly hit and Sarah felt the impact through her entire body, felt the airframe shuddering as it began to break apart. The windscreen was filled with sparks, with the gray blur of asphalt racing past, with pieces of the aircraft separating and flying away. She kept her hands on the controls even though they were meaningless now, kept trying to steer even as the aircraft skidded and spun, kept fighting to keep them on the road instead of tumbling into the forest on either side. The nose began to swing left and Sarah overcorrected, then corrected again, trying to use aerodynamic surfaces and friction to keep them straight while everything fell apart around her. The semi-truck passed by in a blur, somehow missed. A car swerved into the ditch. The aircraft was disintegrating, the wings breaking away, the tail section separating, but the fuselage was still sliding forward, still more or less straight, still on the road. And then, after an eternity compressed into 18 seconds, they stopped. The sudden absence of motion was shocking. The silence even more so, after the incredible noise of impact. Sarah sat with her hands still gripping the yoke, breathing hard, unable to quite believe they weren't moving anymore. Around her, the cockpit was filled with smoke and the smell of burning metal and hydraulic fluid. "Out," she said hoarsely. "Everyone out now." The co-pilot was already moving, fumbling with his harness. Richardson was up too, pushing open the cockpit door to reveal the cabin beyond, remarkably intact, the fuselage structure having held better than anyone had any right to expect. Through the smoke, Sarah could see passengers beginning to move, beginning to realize they were alive, starting the confused exodus toward emergency exits. She stayed in her seat for one more moment, hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading, and looked at the destroyed highway behind them through the side window. They'd carved a scar 300 yards long through the asphalt, left debris scattered like breadcrumbs, destroyed what had been a functioning aircraft. But behind her, she could hear voices, confused voices, frightened voices, crying voices, but living voices. 203 people who should have been dead. Sarah unbuckled her harness and stood on legs that felt like water. She made her way through the cabin, following the stream of passengers climbing over seats and pushing toward the emergency exits that flight attendants had managed to open. Nobody was looking at her. Nobody was seeing her. She was just another passenger in the evacuation, anonymous in the chaos. She climbed out through an exit near the wing, or what had been the wing before it broke away during the landing. She jumped down to the asphalt, her work boots hitting the road with a solid thunk that sent pain up through her knees. Around her, people were collapsing onto the ground, hugging each other, crying, laughing hysterically. Emergency vehicles were already approaching from both directions, sirens wailing. Sarah walked away from the wreckage, heading toward the tree line on the side of the road. Behind her, she heard Captain Richardson's voice calling, "Where's the pilot? Where's the woman who?" But Sarah kept walking. She'd done what needed doing. The rest was paperwork and questions and attention she didn't want. She'd come out of hiding to save 203 lives. And now she was going back into hiding, because that's where she belonged. A pickup truck pulled up beside her. An old farmer in overalls looked concerned. "You all right, miss? You from that plane?" "Yeah," Sarah said, her voice rough from smoke. "I'm fine. You headed toward Iowa by any chance?" "Near enough. Need a ride?" "That would be appreciated." She climbed into the truck and didn't look back as they drove away from the scene. Behind her, survivors gathered by the wreckage, emergency personnel began their response, and someone probably realized that the mysterious pilot had disappeared. But Sarah was done with that part of her life again, done with the questions and recognition. She'd be back on her farm by tomorrow. Back to wheat and corn and a life measured in seasons instead of seconds. Back to being just a farmer in worn boots and patched clothes, invisible again to everyone who didn't know how to see her. The pickup truck driver glanced at her, taking in her disheveled appearance and the distant look in her eyes. "Hell of a thing. That plane crash. Landing," Sarah corrected quietly. "It was a landing." He didn't push for more conversation, and Sarah was grateful. Out the window, Iowa farmland rolled past, endless fields of green and gold, ordinary and beautiful. Sarah watched it with the eyes of someone who had just remembered exactly why she'd chosen this life over the other one. Flying was in her blood, would always be in her blood. But so was the need for peace, for simplicity, for work that didn't require calculating death probabilities before breakfast. She'd saved 203 lives today using skills she'd thought she'd left behind forever. And tomorrow she'd go back to saving wheat from drought, which was a slower kind of heroism, but heroism nonetheless. The truck carried her toward home, toward the quiet life she'd built from the pieces of the old one, toward the person she'd chosen to become. Behind her, the world would wonder about the mysterious pilot who'd appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. Let them wonder. Some stories didn't need endings where everyone knew all the answers. But the story didn't end there, because stories about people who save lives never really end. They just change shape. 3 days later, Sarah was back on her farm, back to the rhythm of early mornings and physical labor that left no room for thinking about anything except the work itself. She was in the north field checking irrigation lines when her phone rang, a number she didn't recognize with a Washington, D.C. area code. She almost didn't answer, but something made her thumb hit the green button. Sarah Chen. The voice was female, professional, with an edge of barely controlled emotion. Speaking. This is Captain Jennifer Richardson from Flight 2847. I got your number from, well, it took some digging, but I'm a determined woman when I need to be. Sarah stood in the middle of her wheat field, irrigation water flowing past her boots, and closed her eyes. Captain, you should be debriefing, not tracking down disappeared passengers. That's exactly why I'm calling. The FAA wants to talk to you. The NTSB wants to talk to you. The airline wants to talk to you. Hell, half the aviation industry wants to talk to you. You performed an emergency procedure that isn't in any manual, saved 203 lives, and then vanished like a ghost. People have questions. I'm sure they do, Sarah said. She watched a hawk circle overhead, riding thermals with an ease that made flying look simple. I'm also sure they'll figure it out without me. You were there. You saw what I did. You can explain it to them. I can explain the mechanics, yes. What I can't explain is who you are. Your name wasn't in any aviation databases. Your background check came back with military service that's so classified I can't even confirm it exists. There are people with security clearances higher than mine who are very curious about the former test pilot turned Iowa farmer who just happened to be on my flight. Sarah felt the old familiar weight settling on her shoulders, the weight of being noticed, of being asked questions, of having her carefully constructed quiet life threatened by the very skills that made that life possible. Captain Richardson, I appreciate you tracking me down, but I really can't help you. What happened 3 days ago it was necessary. I did what needed doing. But I'm not interested in interviews or investigations or whatever else comes with that kind of attention. I just want to go back to my life. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Richardson spoke again, her voice was softer, more understanding. You're hiding from something. I'm not hiding. I'm living. Those aren't mutually exclusive in my experience. Another pause. Look, I'm not going to force you into anything, but there's someone else who wants to talk to you. A passenger from 14B, the man sitting next to you. His name is Marcus Webb, and he's been asking about you since we evacuated. He says he watched you through the entire crisis, saw how calm you were, how you moved with purpose when everyone else was preparing to die. He wants to thank you. Sarah remembered the man in 14B, the one who'd been frantically typing on his phone, tears streaming down his face, trying to say goodbye to his wife. He doesn't need to thank me. I didn't do it for gratitude. I know, but sometimes gratitude isn't about what the giver needs, it's about what the receiver needs. He has 3 kids, Sarah. 3 kids who still have a father because you stood up when you could have stayed seated. Let him say thank you. That's all he wants. Sarah looked across her farm at the land that had given her peace and purpose for 16 years. She thought about the choice she'd made 3 days ago, the choice to stop hiding her expertise, even temporarily, to save lives. Maybe hiding wasn't the same as living. Maybe real living meant accepting that your past didn't define you, but it was still part of you, and sometimes it had value beyond what you'd realized. All right, she said quietly. Give him my number, but only him. I'm not doing interviews or press conferences or any of that. Understood. And Sarah, thank you. From me, from my crew, from everyone who made it home because of what you did. You say you don't want gratitude, but you're getting it anyway. Some debts can't be avoided just because you don't want them. The call ended and Sarah stood in her field, phone in hand, wondering if she'd made the right decision. The old Sarah, the test pilot Sarah, would have said yes without hesitation, would have embraced the attention and the recognition. The farmer Sarah wanted to say no, wanted to retreat back into anonymity. The real Sarah, the one who existed in the complicated space between those two extremes, wasn't sure which impulse to trust. The phone rang again 20 minutes later, a different number, local area code this time. Miss Chen, this is Marcus Webb. Captain Richardson gave me your number. I hope it's okay that I'm calling. His voice was warm, genuine, with the slight tremor of someone who'd recently confronted their own mortality and was still processing it. Sarah found herself smiling despite her reservations. It's okay, Mr. Webb. The captain said you wanted to talk. I wanted to say thank you, but that seems inadequate for what you did. I watched you, during the crisis. Everyone else was panicking or praying or saying goodbye, and you were just calm, like you knew something the rest of us didn't. And then you stood up and walked to the cockpit, and I thought you were crazy. But there was something about the way you moved, like you knew exactly what you were doing even in the middle of chaos. Sarah leaned against her truck, boots muddy from the field. I did know what I was doing. That's the thing about training. It stays with you even when you think you've left it behind. Captain Richardson told me you were a military special pilot or something. Test pilot. I flew experimental aircraft for the Air Force, things that were more theory than reality. It was a lifetime ago. And now you're a farmer in Iowa. Now I'm a farmer in Iowa, Sarah confirmed. It's a good life. Quiet, honest. The land doesn't care about your past. It just cares whether you show up and do the work. Marcus was quiet for a moment. I was writing to my wife when you stood up, trying to tell her everything I needed to say in a text message because I knew I'd never get another chance. I have 3 kids. Emma's 8, Jackson's 6, and little Sophie just turned 4. I was trying to figure out how to say goodbye to them in 160 characters. Sarah's throat tightened. You don't have to tell me this. I do, though, because you need to know what you saved. It wasn't just 203 lives in the abstract. It was Emma's father. It was Sophie's bedtime story reader. It was my wife's partner of 12 years. It was all of those specific, individual, irreplaceable relationships. You gave those back to people who thought they were gone forever. Marcus, I appreciate what you're saying, but I was just doing what anyone with my training would have done in that situation. No, his voice was firm now, certain. Anyone with your training who was still actively flying, maybe. But you walked away from that life. You chose not to be that person anymore. And then when it mattered, you chose to be that person again, just for a few minutes, because people needed you. That's not just training. That's character. That's the kind of choice that defines who someone really is. Sarah didn't know what to say to that. She'd spent 16 years trying to define herself as someone other than the test pilot, someone simpler and less complicated. But Marcus was right. The choice she'd made in Seat 14C hadn't been about training or muscle memory. It had been about recognizing that her past, however much she tried to leave it behind, still had value, that the skills she'd spent so many years developing weren't just tools for destruction or risk, they were tools for saving lives. And sometimes using them was the right thing to do, even if it meant exposing herself to the exact kind of attention she'd been avoiding. You have kids who need their father, Sarah said finally. I'm glad I could make sure they still have one. Emma wants to meet you, Marcus said, and Sarah could hear the smile in his voice. She's decided you're a superhero. I tried to explain that you're just a regular person with special training, but 8-year-olds don't really do nuance. In her mind, you're basically Wonder Woman. Despite everything, Sarah laughed. I'm definitely not Wonder Woman. I'm a 42-year-old farmer with chronic back pain and a mortgage. You're a 42-year-old farmer who landed a broken aircraft on a highway and saved 203 lives. That's pretty close to Wonder Woman in my book. He paused. Look, I know you value your privacy. Captain Richardson made that very clear, but if you're ever willing to meet Emma, even just for a few minutes, it would mean the world to her and to me. No pressure, no expectations. Just think about it. I'll think about it, Sarah promised, and was surprised to find that she meant it. Over the next week, Sarah's phone rang with increasing frequency, other passengers from Flight 2847, having gotten her number through various channels of determination and social media detective work. Each call was a variation on the same theme: gratitude, questions, requests to meet or talk, or just to hear her voice and confirm that the mysterious pilot was real and not some collective hallucination born of trauma and terror. She took some of the calls and ignored others, trying to find a balance between her need for privacy and her growing understanding that what she'd done had created connections she couldn't simply dissolve by wanting them not to exist. These people had looked death in the face and been pulled back at the last moment by her actions. That created a bond, whether she wanted it or not. The media attention started on day 8. A local news station in Des Moines somehow tracked her down, and suddenly there was a reporter on her doorstep asking for an interview about the hero farmer who saved Flight 2847. Sarah declined, but the story ran anyway, speculation and second-hand accounts woven into a narrative that bore only passing resemblance to reality but was compelling enough to get picked up by regional outlets, then national ones. Within 48 hours, Sarah Chen was no longer anonymous. Her face was on news websites. Her story was being told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy, and aviation enthusiasts were digging through declassified military records trying to piece together her background. The quiet life she'd built so carefully was cracking open like an egg, and there was no way to put it back together. She was repairing a fence in the south pasture when a car pulled up her long driveway, a nice car, too clean for farm roads, with rental plates. Sarah set down her post-hole digger and waited, already knowing this wasn't going to be a neighbor stopping by to chat about the weather. The woman who got out was in her 60s, professional and polished in a way that spoke of boardrooms and important meetings. She walked toward Sarah with the confident stride of someone used to getting what they wanted. "Miss Chen, my name is Dr. Patricia Holloway. I'm the director of the Aviation Safety Research Institute at MIT. I was hoping we could talk." Sarah wiped her hands on her jeans. "Dr. Holloway, I appreciate you driving all the way out here, but if this is about Flight 2847, I've already declined several interview requests. I'm not interested in publicity." "This isn't about publicity." Dr. Holloway stopped a respectful distance away, not invading Sarah's space but close enough to speak without shouting. "This is about what you did. The procedure you used, the controlled spiral descent with asymmetric configuration, that's not in any manual. That's improvisation at a level that suggests deep understanding of aerodynamic principles combined with practical experience in extreme scenarios. What you did shouldn't have worked according to conventional aviation wisdom. But it did work, and that means there's something to learn here." Sarah felt her resistance wavering. This wasn't a reporter looking for a dramatic story or a passenger looking to say thank you. This was a scientist looking for knowledge. That was different. That was harder to dismiss. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A collaboration. You help me understand the thinking behind your procedure, the calculations you made, the principles you applied, the risks you accepted and why. We document it. We test it in simulators. We figure out if it's something that can be taught or if it only works in specific scenarios with specific damage configurations. And then we publish it. Not as a story about you. You can remain as anonymous as you want in the academic literature, but as a case study in emergency aviation procedures that exceeded standard protocols." "Why would I want to do that?" "Because knowledge that exists in only one person's head is knowledge that dies with them." Dr. Holloway's voice was passionate now, intense. "You saved 203 people using a technique that no one else knew about. What happens the next time an aircraft faces similar circumstances, but you're not on board? What happens to those passengers? You can't be everywhere, Miss Chen. But your knowledge can be. It can be in manuals and training programs and simulator exercises. It can save people you'll never meet in situations you'll never know about. Isn't that worth a few weeks of your time?" Sarah looked across her farm at the life she'd built from choosing not to be the test pilot anymore. But drive. Holloway was right. Some knowledge was too valuable to keep hidden. She'd walked away from aviation because she needed to save herself from the constant proximity to death, from the burden of testing things that might kill her. But this was different. This wasn't about risking her own life anymore. This was about giving others the tools to save theirs. "All right," Sarah said slowly. "But I have conditions. I'm not leaving my farm for more than a few days at a time. I'm not doing media appearances, and anything published attributes the procedure to an experienced pilot, or something generic, not to me specifically. I help you understand what I did and why. You turn it into something that can help other people. And then I go back to my life. Deal?" "Drive." Holloway smiled, a genuine expression of respect and gratitude. "When can we start?" They started the next morning. Dr. Holloway set up in Sarah's kitchen with a laptop and recording equipment, and for 6 hours they went through every moment of the emergency, every decision point, every calculation, every instinctive judgment call. Sarah found herself back in that cockpit in her mind, reliving the spiral descent and the desperate final glide, explaining not just what she'd done but why she'd done it, what assumptions she'd made, what risks she'd accepted. It was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure, exhausting because she was confronting the intensity of those moments all over again, exhilarating because she was finally able to articulate knowledge that had been locked in her head for years, unable to be shared because no one had ever asked the right questions. The key thing most pilots don't understand, Sarah said at one point, gesturing with her coffee cup for emphasis, is that aircraft want to fly. They're designed to be stable, to find equilibrium. When something breaks that stability, like asymmetric wing damage, the natural instinct is to fight it, to force the aircraft back into normal flight parameters. But sometimes fighting is what kills you. Sometimes you have to work with the instability, use it as a tool instead of treating it as an enemy. That's not intuitive. That's not what standard training teaches. But it's what experimental test flying taught me, that the edge of control isn't always where you think it is, and sometimes the solution to an impossible situation is to accept the impossibility and work within it rather than against it. Dr. Holloway was taking notes rapidly, her eyes bright with intellectual excitement. And you calculated all of this in real time. Some of it was calculation. Most of it was feel, muscle memory and pattern recognition from hundreds of flights in damaged or experimental aircraft. When you've flown enough aircraft at the edge of control, you start to recognize the patterns, the way airframes respond to different inputs under stress. It's like, Sarah paused, searching for the right comparison. It's like a really experienced farmer can look at a field and know how the harvest is going to go before the crop is even fully grown. It's pattern recognition built from so much experience that it feels like instinct, even though it's actually highly sophisticated analysis happening too fast for conscious thought. That's going to be the challenge, drive. Holloway said, thoughtfully. How do we teach pattern recognition to pilots who haven't spent years flying damaged experimental aircraft? How do we distill your experience into something that can be trained? Simulators, Sarah said immediately. Extensive simulator training with realistic emergency scenarios that go beyond standard procedure responses, force pilots to improvise, to think outside their training manuals, to develop comfort with making decisions in situations where there's no right answer in the handbook. The military does some of this, but commercial aviation training is too focused on following procedures. There needs to be a balance. Yes, follow procedures when they apply, but also develop the judgment to know when procedures aren't enough and improvisation becomes necessary. They worked together for 3 weeks, with Dr. Holloway making regular trips to the farm and Sarah occasionally driving to MIT's facilities for simulator testing. They recreated the emergency, tested variations, mapped out the boundaries of when Sarah's procedure would work and when it would fail. They documented everything with the precision of academic research and the practical focus of people who knew this information might someday save lives. And gradually, Sarah found herself changing, not going back to being the test pilot. That part of her life was still over, still something she had deliberately left behind, but integrating it more honestly into who she was now. She was the farmer in 14C. She was also the person who could save 203 lives when circumstances demanded it. Those identities weren't contradictory. They were both true, both valuable, both part of the complicated reality of being a person who'd lived multiple lives and carried all of them forward. Marcus Webb did bring his daughter to meet her. Emma showed up at the farm with her father, wide-eyed and shy, carrying a drawing she'd made of what she imagined the emergency landing looked like, wildly inaccurate in the details, but capturing something essential about the emotion of it. Sarah spent an hour showing Emma around the farm, explaining how crops grew and letting the 8-year-old help feed the chickens, and didn't mention that she found the whole experience more meaningful than she'd expected. She drew that picture every day for a week after the crash, Marcus told Sarah as they watched Emma chase butterflies in the wheat field. She was having nightmares, barely sleeping, processing the trauma the way kids do. And then she decided you were a hero. And something about that narrative helped her make sense of what happened. It gave her a story where people can be saved, where being scared doesn't mean you're helpless. That's a gift, Sarah. That's not something I can repay. You don't need to repay it, Sarah said, watching Emma's joy in the simple act of running through a field. Seeing her happy is enough. The FAA investigation concluded after 6 weeks. The official report credited unconventional emergency procedures executed by a qualified pilot passenger, with preventing total loss of the aircraft and all aboard. It recommended further study of emergency response scenarios that exceeded standard training protocols. It did not name Sarah Chen specifically, at her request, but everyone in aviation knew who they were talking about. She received a letter from the airline, a formal thank you signed by the CEO, along with a lifetime pass for free flights anywhere their aircraft went. She said it aside with a wry smile, knowing she wouldn't use it. She'd flown enough for 3 lifetimes. She received letters from passengers too, dozens of them, then hundreds, as more people tracked her down or wrote to her through the airline. She read them all, even when they made her cry, even when they made her question her decision to stay hidden on the farm instead of stepping into the public role some people thought she should embrace. Each letter was a reminder that what she'd done had ripples extending far beyond those 18 seconds of landing, ripples touching families and friends and futures that would have been erased if not for a farmer in seat 14C who remembered how to fly. 6 months after Flight 2847, Drive, Holloway's paper was published in the Journal of Aviation Safety, Unconventional Recovery Procedures in Catastrophic Emergency Scenarios, a case study in adaptive pilot decision-making. It was dense, technical, filled with aerodynamic analysis and simulator data, and it would probably be read by fewer than 1,000 people. But those 1,000 people would be pilots, aviation safety researchers, and training instructors. They would learn, they would teach others, and someday maybe someone would face an impossible situation and remember a case study about spiral descent with asymmetric configuration, and that memory might save lives. Sarah Chen went back to farming, truly back this time, with the peaceful acceptance of someone who'd fully integrated all the parts of herself. She grew corn and soybeans. She repaired fences and managed irrigation. She watched seasons change and found meaning in work that was simple and honest and connected to the earth in ways that flying never had been. But on quiet evenings, sitting on her porch with a beer and watching the sun set over Iowa farmland, she sometimes thought about that flight, about the moment of decision in seat 14C, about 203 people who'd gone home to their families because she'd chosen not to stay seated, about the complicated truth that you could leave a life behind without erasing it, could choose simplicity without pretending complexity had never existed. She was a farmer. She would always be a farmer now, had earned that identity through years of work and dedication to the land. But she was also the person who'd landed a broken aircraft on a highway when every rule said it was impossible. Both truths existed simultaneously, neither canceling the other out. And sometimes that was enough. Being both things at once, living in the complicated middle space between who you used to be and who you'd chosen to become, accepting that the past never fully releases you, but that doesn't mean it has to define you. The wheat grew, the seasons turned, life continued, and somewhere in the sky above her farm, aircraft flew safely on, carrying passengers who didn't know that one of the people who'd made aviation slightly safer lived in an old farmhouse in Iowa and preferred the company of chickens to the roar of jet engines. That was fine with Sarah. Some heroes wore capes and stood in spotlights. Others wore work boots and stood in wheat fields, and both kinds were necessary. She was at peace with being the second kind.